Welcome to Bugis and welcome to our walking tour. My name is Min Yi and I'm going to be your guide. I'll tell you more about myself a little later on because we have lots to explore right now. Before we get going, I'd like to tell you more about this area. Take a seat on either side of the fountain between McDonald's and Starbucks in the open courtyard. Today, we'll be walking through a part of Singapore where the past mingles with the present and where the youth of Singapore live, work, and play. The heritage of Singapore is dense and layered, which is inevitable for a city-state with not much space. We'll see refurbished buildings whose present-day functions would not be allowed at all in their original pious institutions. We'll brush past museums, hotels, and schools. And then, we'll end with a tale or two of Singapore's haunted history. Let's start with the history of the Bugis area, which has always been buzzing with energy. The Bugis people of South Sulawesi in Indonesia used to sail through a nearby canal to trade with merchants. They were here so much that the area was named after them. They were also so famous as bloodthirsty pirates that the Dutch and British ships soon learned to fear the Bugis Man, or the Boogeyman. We're going to get going now. With the fountain and McDonald's behind you, head toward the main road and turn right just before Topshop. If you see plenty of pedestrians, you're at the right place. I'll tell you more as we walk. History works in interesting serendipitous ways, and the appeal of the Bugis area in the 20th century can be traced to earlier times. You see, the Bugis people recognize 5 distinct genders within their culture, including 3 non-heteronormative ones. Perhaps, knowing this about the Bugis culture, the transgenders of Singapore chose the Bugis area to be theirs. We'll talk more about the party culture of Bugis in the 1950s at our next destination, the street that started it all. Today, Bugis is an extremely popular area for food, shopping, and all types of entertainment, from IMAX movie theaters to karaoke. As you walk to Topshop, let me tell you how VoiceMap works. VoiceMap uses your location to automatically play commentary, so you can just put your phone away and focus on your surroundings. I'll give you directions to keep you on track throughout. There might be a bit of silence now and again, but you can just keep walking and my voice will kick in at each location. Stop here and I'll tell you about Bugis Street, the street market across the road. You may want to sit on the concrete ledge in front of Topshop so that you're out of the way of the crowds. Before we plunge into the Bugis Street of yesteryear, let's talk about what you see in front of your eyes. Bugis Street is a hot, bustling, and nearly claustrophobic street market selling everything from I Love Singapore shirts to sex toys. It's Singapore's version of Tokyo's Harajuku, except it's cheaper and has a lot more food. Visitors usually stick to the ground floor where the human traffic carries you from shop to shop. But if you have the time, above the sweltering market below, there are air-conditioned floors upstairs where teenagers shop for street fashion. Now, for the Bugis Street of the 1950s. For those who think of Singapore and think of clean, green, upright, and law-abiding, here's an alternative picture of its gritty, glamorous underbelly. There was a massive cleanup in the 1980s, but before that, Bugis Street was a massive party site. The sexy, sleazy splendor was world famous. After sundown, it was closed to traffic for food stall owners to put out rows of tables and chairs. The street would fill with patrons looking for supper and transvestites looking for patrons. In those days, you had to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola for a whopping $10 to be let inside. Tourists, locals, and sailors on their way from New Zealand to the US of A would attend glamour shows by the Singaporean transgender community. For hours each night, the gambling dens and disco craze turned Bugis Street into Boogie Street. and the stench of urine coming from the bathrooms turned everyone's faces green. Back then, if you wanted to pee, you had to stand in pee. If you weren't taking a piss, there was only one other reason to be hanging around the bathrooms, and that was to watch the dance of the flaming arseholes. This Australian Navy import took place on top of the bathroom building. Volunteers would strip, place a roll of newspaper between their naked buttocks, set the paper on fire, and flaunt their catwalk skills to an admiring drunken crowd. You may get arrested if you try that today. Let's cross Victoria Street now at the pedestrian crossing ahead. You can take a look inside Bugis Street now, but first, let me show you where to meet me afterwards. Look to your left, further down Victoria Street. You'll see a shopping complex with white hexagonal tiles. That's Bugis Plus Shopping Mall. I'll see you there when you're ready. On your right is Bugis Plus, the huge shopping complex with white hexagonal tiles. You don't need to go inside unless you're dying for a blast of air conditioning. Singapore has lots of malls, but that doesn't mean we spend all our time shopping. Just like being surrounded by lots of restaurants doesn't mean you're eating all the time, even though Singaporeans love their food as well. In Singapore, shopping malls do more than take your money and give you things. They have public libraries, spaces for events like fashion shows, rooftop gardens, dog parks, and even playgrounds. That's how we make use of the limited land space we have. Now that we're out of the crush of the Bugis Street area, it's finally time for me to introduce myself. My name is Min Yi, and I'm a 22-year-old Singaporean with two younger sisters. I'm currently a university student in the east coast of the US, but I'll be back in Singapore soon enough to contribute to my nation and make more audio tours. I love reading, writing, rock climbing, and watching unsettling films. And my favorite Singaporean foods include bak chor mee, or mincemeat noodles, and teh si, tea with evaporated milk. I highly recommend both. Anyway, just keep walking straight. I'll talk to you again soon. While you walk, look to your left. On the other side of Victoria Street, you'll see the National Library of Singapore. It's curved, tall, and white with lots of glass. While this 16-story building was only opened in 2005, the National Library has a longer history. It reaches back to 1823 as Singapore's first public library. Beyond books, the National Library provides a venue for drama performances, study rooms, and other events. If you're back in the area when we're done, it's worth coming back here to take the lift to level 5 or level 10. On those floors are public gardens with a bird's eye view of the city. Take a seat on one of the benches facing the church. Before you is St. Joseph's Church, established by Portuguese missionaries in the 1850s. In 1825, there was only one Catholic priest in the British colony of Singapore who served a small group of European settlers. He came from Macau, but was originally from Portugal. Under his care, the Catholic community in Singapore grew, and in 1906, the original church was demolished and the Gothic style one you see today was built. There are three figures in the arch before you. They are St. John of God, St. Joseph, and St. John of Brito. The two St. Johns are Portuguese saints. The church is no longer linked to the Portuguese, but its architecture and iconography remains decidedly so. As of 2015, about 6% of Singapore's population follows the Roman Catholic faith. That's about 300,000 people. They are mostly Chinese, Eurasian, Filipino, Indian, and European. Let's get up. Before you start walking again, look to the left of the church to the black, grey, and white building. You'll see an alcove on the wall facing St. Joseph's Church. There, a figure of Our Lady of Fatima, a Portuguese title for the Virgin Mary, stands watch. Now, look back again at the National Library building. Do you see the tall blocks of blue and white buildings? They're public housing flats, sold to homeowners at a subsidized price. I'll tell you about them as we continue down Victoria Street. Let's start walking. Just like Singapore's landscape, the public housing flats are dense, vertical, and mixed. When you are an island of 5 million inhabitants living across 46 kilometers, or 29 miles, you need to build upwards. The way Singapore has planned its housing ensures that no ethnic or economic enclaves can form. You will find bungalows next to blocks of flats, and Arabs, Chinese, Eurasians, Indians, Malays, and more being your neighbors. There is actually an ethnic integration policy that makes sure that no one race predominates in any neighborhood. And with over 80% of Singaporeans living in public housing, city planners make sure that neighborhoods are more than just livable, but lovable too. In multiracial, multi-religious Singapore, the festive days of Malay, Indian, Chinese, and Eurasian cultures are celebrated by all as public holidays. Hari Raya Puasa, Deepavali, the Chinese New Year, and Good Friday are just some of the holidays we commemorate. Until I studied abroad and visited cities of Europe and America, I took this respect and preservation of minority cultures for granted. Let's cross Victoria Street now to walk up Miller Street. Take a look at the building across the road. That's the Bras Basah complex. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. Now, keep Bras Basah complex on your left and proceed straight down Miller Street. We'll be walking next to a car park, so watch out. Bras Basah gets its name from the Malay term for wet rice, which was once laid out to dry on the banks of a nearby river. Back then, the Bras Basah neighborhood was designated as a European area by the British colonial planners. It explains the prevalence of Catholic churches and missionary run schools. Bras Basah Complex is a local landmark today for anyone who's ever needed a textbook for school or any kind of stationery. You can get photocopies of test papers for extra practice at examinations or comic books when you're done with exams. Just keep walking straight. Let's cross the road here. It's a one-way street, so just watch out for turning vehicles. The pretty white building with emerald green balustrades is the Raffles Hotel. Go onto its cobblestone driveway. I'll tell you more when we get there. Now, walk under the marble columns of the Raffles Hotel and take a seat on any of the benches along the corridors. I'll tell you a bit about the hotel while you sit. If you arrived in the city on a Singapore Airlines plane, you may have spotted a Singapore Sling cocktail on the menu. And now, you have arrived at its birthplace, the Raffles Hotel. In 1887, a pair of enterprising Armenian brothers from Iran received the lease to this land. They established the colonial-style Raffles Hotel, named after the founder of modern Singapore. It accepted guests of all races. We take this for granted today, but it was exceptional back then. It also had roller skating nights in the hotel lobby, which is exceptional on a different scale. The hotel has come a long way from having Singapore's first electric lights, fans, and French chef. Through the decades, it has hosted famous personalities. 12 suites have been named after them. So today, you can have the Rudyard Kipling Suite, Charlie Chaplin Suite, Ava Gardner Suite, and more. Until the 70s and the 80s, the Raffles Hotel was right by the sea. But after land reclamation in the area, the coast is now half a kilometer from the hotel. Being surrounded by traffic instead of lapping waves doesn't seem to have taken away the peaceful quality of the hotel. The neo-Renaissance architecture works hard to take you back in time, especially the marble columns and teak verandas in the colonial revival style. The hotel has 3 floors of premium shops. One of them, CYC, the custom shop, is Singapore's oldest bespoke tailor. Our first Prime Minister, the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, had his shirts and suits tailored here. He would have his name embroidered on his clothes and would keep them for many years of use. If the hotel looks luxurious, here's a figure to give you a sense of how luxurious. In 2015, at the time this tour was created, the most expensive suite went for 10,000 Singapore dollars a night. That's a premium price tag for a hotel favored by royal guests and heads of states from the world around. Let's get up now. You can stop by the courtyard of the hotel before we move on. You'll know you're there when you see lots of guests lounging over white tables. A large glass of wine will cost you, but looking is free. When you're ready, carry on going along North Bridge Road with the hotel on your left.
Not all who wander are lost, but it looks like you might be. Now is a good time to take a look at the map on your screen.
We're heading diagonally across this intersection to the compound with orange roof tiles. Let's turn right and cross over the road here. Then, we'll cross the road again to reach our next stop. Let's walk straight along the outer wall of chimes, our next destination. We're not going to take this entrance, but the next one. I'm going to tell you a bit about where the name came from as we move. Chimes, Chijmes, is the secular repurposing of what used to be a chapel, orphanage, and convent school. The first part of its name, Chij, stands for the Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus, which is what this building used to be until 1989. The MES part of its name doesn't mean anything, but we wanted to preserve the CHIJ part of its history without making the venue too tedious to pronounce. Meeting at Chimes for drinks is a lot easier and less confusing than meeting at CHIJ, especially because the CHIJ school still exists today. So instead of demolishing the beautiful compound, we preserved and adapted it for commercial purposes. This is heritage in a nation where land is supremely precious. So what exactly is the heritage of Chimes? I'll tell you more when we get there. Welcome to Chimes, another picturesque establishment among skyscraping shopping malls. Let's go inside through the entrance ahead of you. Once you're in the compound, make your way onto the lawn where you'll see the chapel in front of you. Stop on the lawn to look at the eye-catching Gothic chapel ahead of you. Its white spires look elegant in this quiet courtyard. This is where the Chimes legacy first made history. From here, you can see the beautiful stained glass, originally from Bruges in Belgium. It has inspired visitors since 1904. This chapel was built by the nuns who ran the Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus from 1854. At the beginning, the convent was a simple wooden bungalow. Just 10 days after the French nuns moved in, they began taking in young pupils. There were two classes, one for fee-paying students and another for orphans and the poor. Slowly but surely, the convent expanded in class size and building size. They received more land acquired by Father Barre, the priest who had called them to Singapore in the first place. He stayed on for the next 30 years. With this land, the CHIJ compound managed to educate thousands of young girls for the next 100 years. They also took care of the destitute and unwanted who arrived at their doorstep. There were many orphans brought up by the nuns of CHIJ. Women who were unable to keep their babies left them at the side gate, praying that their child would have a better chance at life with the nuns. Soon, the gate adopted its nickname of Baby Gate, or the Gate of Hope. The babies, often weak or malnourished, were raised and taught vocational skills if they survived. After 1983, the school relocated, the chapel was deconsecrated, and the entire complex was restored and redeveloped to become the chimes of today. Now, to get to the next location is a little tricky. First, walk around the chapel to the right. You'll see a row of archways in front of a covered passage. We'll be walking into the passage straight ahead, all the way through to the parking lot outside Chimes on the far side. I'll meet you there. Okay, now turn right to walk along the passageway towards the round-shaped building on the corner. Let's stop for a moment. This is Caldwell House. Like the chapel, Caldwell House is a designated national monument. It was the very bungalow in which the infant Jesus sisters read, wrote, and sewed. It's the oldest building in the enclave and the first one acquired by the same Father Barre we talked about. It's also the second oldest building in Singapore after the old Parliament House along the Singapore River. We'll exit Chimes now. Look to the far corner of the parking lot and you'll see a covered exit leading to the street. Go out that way. I'll meet you outside. Believe it or not, we're back on Victoria Street. You can even see Bugis Plus Shopping Mall in the distance to the right. Before we carry on, take a look back, because the view of Chimes on this side is just as beautiful. When you're ready, cross Victoria Street towards the cathedral on the corner. I'll see you there. Let's walk along Bras Basah Road. On your left is the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd, the oldest Catholic church in Singapore. It was established in 1832. The Neo-Palladian porticos and steeple are its most prominent features, which a 30 million restoration in 2015 made sure to keep. Just keep walking straight. I'll meet you a few blocks ahead. Let's stop for a moment. Have a quick look to your left. There's a big, black, sprawling pool on the other side of the road. It was built to let sunlight into Bras Basah Station, Singapore's deepest underground station at 35 meters or 115 feet. Just thought I'd point that out. But the main reason we're stopped here is to your right. The white building with the orangey red roof is the Singapore Art Museum. Remember Father Barre from CHIJ? Before he began establishing CHIJ, and after he helped set up the Cathedral of the Good Shepherd, he opened a school for boys right here. The building was originally constructed in 1852 by a priest-cum-architect who came from France with Father Barre. Additions to the structure, like the blue teak dome, were slowly added to this Baroque landmark. If you look beneath the arch, you'll see a statue of Saint John Baptist de la Salle with a child on either side. This cast iron statue seemed to be pointing towards St. Andrew's School, so the in-joke then was that the statue is directing the graduates of St. Joseph's onward to St. Andrew's School, where they could go after graduation. The remaining traces of St. Joseph Institution's founders can also be seen on the crest fronting the building. Signum Fidei means sign of the faith. This is the motto of the De La Salle brothers, who have students in over 80 countries these days. Let's start walking again. Like with CHIJ, Father Barre settled the logistics by acquiring land and then getting the manpower to staff the Catholic school. His reasoning was that schools were necessary for inculcating a Christian faith in children. And for over 100 years until 1987, the St. Joseph's Institution operated here. After 1996, the school relocated and the building was converted to become the Singapore Art Museum. Today, it houses the world's largest public collection of contemporary Southeast Asian art. Turn left here on the concrete pathway before the School of Information Systems building. We're going to cut diagonally across the campus lawn of Singapore Management University, SMU, keeping the School of Information Systems on our right. Depending on the time of the day and the day of the week, you might spot university students studying on benches or having a leisurely picnic under old trees. SMU, founded in 2000, is Singapore's third public university with 7,500 undergraduates. When the school day is over, SMU students take advantage of their proximity to Singapore's downtown and nightlife district in Quay, where we will end our tour. Depending on how hungry you are, you might want to grab a bite at the nearby food stalls. There are benches everywhere, and there will be benches at our next stop too. I'll meet you at the crossing of Fort Canning Road and Orchard Road on the other side of campus when you're ready. Let's cross the road here and walk towards the National Museum of Singapore. It's the big white building on the other side of the road. Now, walk along the path on your left towards the entrance of the museum. Before we go in, stop here at the entrance for a moment. Today, the museum itself is an architect's mix and match dream. Have a look at the original neoclassical facade. The front of the museum is a rectangular block. Behind this block is a much larger, longer, and newer extension block which lies parallel to this one. The extension block is made of glass and metal fused together in clean and simple modernism. Like the National Library, which we saw earlier, the National Museum of Singapore began as a proposal by Sir Stamford Raffles. So far, we've seen a convent turned dining plaza and a boys' school turned art museum. But unlike many of the repurposed buildings that we've looked at, the National Museum is a piece of heritage that stands in its original skin. Let's go inside now. Public access to the museum grounds is free, and tickets are only required for the galleries. When you enter, remember to look up at the domes in the first and second rotundas. They're fascinating. You can take your time in the museum. When you're ready, I'll meet you outside the back entrance. You'll get there by moving through the extension wing at the back. You'll need to go up the escalator, then up some steps to get out to Fort Canning Park. You can take a look at the map on your screen to help you find our next location. With the museum behind you, take the pedestrian crossing over the road and walk left to the second pedestrian crossing. Let's cross here and walk towards the white Gothic gate ahead. Stop here at the gateway to the first Christian cemetery. This is one of a pair of Gothic gates that have kept guard over the cemetery since 1846. At the time of construction, one gate was facing the sea and the other faced inland. The letters on the front, IHS, stand for Iota Heta Sigma. Those are the first three letters of the Greek word for Jesus. The designer, Captain Charles Edward Faber, was the colony's superintending engineer. And he was definitely not Greek. Unfortunately, he was definitely not a star architect either. Most of his engineering constructions tumbled down over time. It's a good thing these two withstood the test of time. Today, they are iconic of Fort Canning Park. Let's walk through the gate now. As you enter, turn right and take a look at the headstones in the boundary wall. You can take a closer look at them if you like. The stately, sprawling building at the top of the hill is the Singapore Pinakothèque de Paris, the first expansion outside Europe by this international private museum. When you're ready, we turn to the central brick path that leads you from the first Gothic gate to our second. Just continue along the path. I'll tell you a bit about the headstones I just showed you. Many of them are for American and British sailors or merchants. Some died young after succumbing to the tropical diseases. Most of the headstones that were originally in this cemetery park were moved to an Armenian church half a kilometer away. And most of the headstones you just saw were brought in from other sites. This former cemetery saw over 600 burials from 1822 to 1865 when it was closed. There isn't a lot of information online about whether Fort Canning Cemetery was ever exhumed. This definitely contributes to the long-standing lore of Fort Canning's paranormal activity. We'll talk about the biggest other reason soon enough. Pass through the second Gothic gate ahead. We're going to enter the Spice Garden. Let's turn right here. We're going to walk up the flight of gentle steps up to the terrace. I want to point out the building with the steep sloping tiled roof on your left. That is the Registry of Marriage building where everyone goes to get legally married. But let's focus on our surroundings a bit. This is the Spice Garden. It's a small replica of the original garden Raffles established here in 1822. That was the first experimental and botanical garden in Singapore. This garden is unobtrusive and blends in nicely with the quiet peace of the park. Back in the 19th century, spices were as valuable as gold to the Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Dutch. They developed their maritime powers to fight over the sources and routes to the spice islands of India and Southeast Asia. Planting a spice garden with nutmeg, clove, and other spices was more than an aesthetic move. It was meant to be lucrative. Have a look at the archaeological dig exhibition here on the terrace. You can move around the railings as I tell you about it. The first archaeological excavation in Singapore happened here in 1984, yielding many important artifacts. At first glance, the archaeological dig exhibition may look underwhelming, like a plateau of dirt. But there is a reason why it's a protected exhibit with its own electric fans. The artifacts uncovered here date back to the 14th century, and they give us a glimpse into a part of Singapore's history that we don't always focus on in the 21st century. It's also a strong reminder that the story that paints Singapore as a sleepy fishing village until the British came along is more fiction than fact. At the back of the terrace, you can see the unearthed fragments. Look out for the signboards on the railings, which explain more about them. When you're done with the exhibition, we'll return to the front of the terrace. There's a path leading away from the Spice Garden and the archaeological dig. I'll meet you further down. Now, we're taking the path on the left. Just keep following the trail. This is part of the park's own 14th century trail. You'll see signboards along the way with information about the gold ornaments found, Singapore and Java, the Royal Palace, and more. Keep an eye out for rain trees and the bird's nest ferns growing on them. If you're lucky, you might also spot the resident family of chickens, roaming wild and free. Now, as promised, here's a bit of history about the hill we're walking on. Before Fort Canning Hill got this name, it was Government Hill, and before that, it was Bukit Larangan. That's the Malay name for Forbidden Hill. In the 14th century, this hill was a resort of former Majapahit kings, but it was also a sacred burial ground for royalty. The indigenous population knew this, even though many tombs were lost over the years. The Forbidden Hill was forbidden out of respect for the dead. Centuries later, the British arrived in Singapore after 1819. They soon resolved their territorial disputes with the Dutch, who were also grabbing at the region. The British convinced the Sultan of Singapore to cede the rest of the island. That very treaty was signed here on Fort Canning Hill. By that time, the hill's elevation in the mouth of the Singapore River had attracted the British. They then set up residence on this hill. Keep walking straight. I'll tell you more in a bit. Eventually, in 1859, a fort was built here, despite the distance from the shore. Indeed, the fort was never used in battle. Instead, it hosted the Surrender Agreement, when the British surrendered Singapore to the Japanese during World War II. This was the largest surrender of British-led military personnel in history. It was also especially calamitous because Singapore had been nicknamed the Gibraltar of the East. So you can imagine the dramatic, dark turns of history that have taken place on this supposedly haunted hill. After World War II, Singapore moved towards independence and the hill became a site for Singaporean military officers. Today, the hill hosts a park, interesting exhibits which students visit on school trips, a recreational club, a wedding registry, and more. Its green lawns, which you saw at the Gothic gates, play host to productions like Shakespeare in the Park or Ballet Under the Stars. Above all, Fort Canning is a green refuge in an already green city. Keep walking straight. Let's continue straight, past the toilets, and take the path on the right up the hill. Can you see the white lighthouse ahead? That's where we're going. As we follow the path, look to the right. There's a cannon on the path above us. These would point south at Singapore's shoreline during World War II in anticipation of a sea offense by the Japanese. Unfortunately, the Japanese came from the north, from Malaysia. Walk left here towards the flagstaff at the second circle to the left. The lighthouse you're passing is a small replica of the original. With a total elevation of 60 meters, thanks to the hill and its own height, it was visible up to 30 kilometers away. It used to be a lot closer to sea before the land reclamation. Let's stop for a moment. The flagstaff before you is a replica of the original wooden one erected in 1825. Before the lighthouse was constructed, a lantern would be hung on the flagstaff. Its purpose was to announce the arrival of merchant ships to the traders in town and call them to the harbor. The flagstaff would also communicate information such as the condition of the ships, any smallpox outbreaks, or whether the ship was carrying gunpowder. Things are very different now with radio signals and satellite tracking. But some things never change. Singapore's ports remain one of the world's busiest. We're near the end of our tour. Let's make our way downhill for the last stop in Fort Canning Park. Take the path to the left to walk past the fountain you can see. Now, carry on past the fountain and head down the staircase. It's going to take you all the way down to Hill Street. Let's turn around here to look at the mural wall. These stone carvings by Balinese artists tell the story of events in the 14th century. There'll be an info board with benches just on your left explaining the scenes. When you're done, continue walking down the wooden flight of stairs that split and weave together. Now, back on the ground, turn right to the old police station. Today, it's used as an office building for various ministries in Singapore. The entrance is on your right between the grey and white striped blocks. As you get closer, note the stone walls with various carvings to your right. Before we cross the road, have a look back at the old police station. You'll be able to see that its 927 windows are brightly painted in a collective rainbow hue, supposedly to increase the vibrant positive energy of a building that has witnessed so much. Let's turn around and cross the road at the pedestrian crossing ahead. We're heading over the bridge where breezy views of the Singapore River await. If you look to the left, you'll see the Marina Bay Sands in the distance with its iconic architecture of a silver bullet of a ship balancing above three soaring glass blocks. Beyond it is another Singaporean attraction, the Gardens by the Bay. And behind that is the Singapore Street, one of the world's busiest. Keep going over the bridge. Have your camera ready for a photograph or two. If this were any time before the 1980s, the smell from the river would have been more pungent than the pea-flooded back alley of Bugis Street. Hands down. In the 1820s, the river traffic exploded with expanding trade and rapid urbanization. With that came oil spills, wastewater, and rubbish. There was hardly any infrastructure to deal with the pollution from factories and farms or from the haphazard disposal of garbage. Of course, that didn't stop people from swimming in the river with snakes and bumboats all around. After decades of unsanitary, overcrowded riverside living, the government got together and promised an extreme makeover in 10 years. They cleared the filth and debris in the waters and, from street hawkers selling food to sand quarries, relocated industries large and small. In 1987, the cleanup was completed with sparkling success thanks to a 91-year-old civil engineer and his team. Since then, passenger ships have docked at the south of Singapore near Sentosa Island and cargo ships in the west of the island. Turn right here to leave the bridge and double back to the river's edge. That's where we'll end the tour. Today, Quay is Singapore's nightlife district, but traces of its trading heyday can be seen in restored warehouses. They've since turned into restaurants and clubs. Among Singaporeans, only those in their late 40s and beyond would remember the old Quay. But now, you know about it too. Welcome to our final stop. We made it! Today, we've looked at the layered history of colonial Singapore's European district, we've talked about raunchy nightlife and haunted hills, and we've seen the insides of government buildings, hotels, museums, and more. I hope our walk together has unlocked a deeper understanding of this unique island city where change is constant and green trees grow everywhere. This is my first walking tour, but it won't be my last, especially if you like what I'm doing. If you have any feedback after this tour, please leave a comment and rate the walk. I'm looking forward to our correspondence. Behind you is Central Shopping Mall, where Quay train station is. If you're peckish, the mall has tons of restaurants. If you're thirsty for some nightlife, you've arrived at the best district in Singapore to do it all. On both sides of the Singapore River before you are bars, clubs, restaurants, and cafes. Take your pick and have a fantastic evening ahead. There are 5.3 million people living their lives on this island. We all have our own Singaporean story, and I enjoyed sharing mine with you today. Thanks for listening.